Welcome and thank you for tuning in. You're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm Daniel Davis. We thought we would take a little celebration of Earth Day today and take a look at some emerging trends that we can introduce to our listeners here where we can find ways to actually establish and experience the reality of what is known as free energy. After all, our carbon fossil fuels have certainly done a lot of damage, especially when people get concerned with global warming and trying to find ways that we can actually achieve ways to break away from fossil fuels and find a cleaner way to approach how we can have energy. Joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program today is Joel Garbon. We've talked with him about 10 years ago, and I'm kind of curious to see what he's been up to these days. He has been investigated by many of them to found that they do work when it comes to free energy and our reliance on fossil fuels. We're going to find out the discovery of a new spring water that's also called AquaLumine that has resulted in extraordinary healing and supersensory experiences by people who have drank it. So let's find out what's going on here, and I'd like to welcome to our guest, Joel Garbon. Joel, thank you for joining us here on the program today.
Oh, hi, Daniel. Thank you for having me on. It's a beautiful day in Portland today.
It sure is. Now, listen, 10 years ago, I think it was about the last time we talked about anything. What have you been up to these days?
Well, we continue to investigate what's going on behind the scenes in breakthrough energy technologies. I run an organization called New Energy Movement, which is a nonprofit that educates about what is happening in frontier energy science. And there's been a lot of acceleration in this field lately, especially in the field of cold fusion, which some of your listeners may be aware of. Largely, the name cold fusion is sometimes thought of as, isn't that thing that was discovered 25 years ago and was quickly dismissed as being junk science? Well, it turns out that there's a lot of gold inside that junk, and that's part of what I'd like to talk about today is where things stand in the cold science field.
Now, tell us about this new energy movement and how you became interested in the energy scene.
Well, the way I came to this was, I had a long-standing career in the chemical and pulp and paper and water treatment industries. And back in, I'd say the late 90s, I had been in an airplane flying over the Amazon at night on my way to Brazil, and I could see these fires all throughout the Amazon. Everyone else on the plane was sound asleep, and I'm just looking out the window, just perplexed and wondering about what are we doing to our planet here. If I could see fires raging all throughout the Amazon. And it struck me very profoundly. And essentially, at that point, I started to offer a prayer asking, what can I do to help? How can I best use my abilities and anything I had learned along the way to help heal what the heck was going on our planet here? Because clearly there's so many things going on that were taking us in the wrong direction. And shortly after that, I got a very powerful, personally profound message that was delivered to me in the form of a voice that told me that I'm to help bring a new form of energy to the planet. And it astounded me. The voice clearly was not my own, and I could not see anything attached to it, but the voice was very, very clear. And in my shock, I just said, well, do you mean like solar energy? And the voice simply, I guess if you could think of a voice smiling, the voice smiled and said, no, not solar energy, but you'll see. Mm-hmm. And I basically said, okay, I will do this, and very quickly things started to happen. There were people, scientists, Apollo astronauts, folks doing all kinds of amazing invention in the energy field started to cross my path, and next thing I knew, I was involved with starting up this grassroots organization called New Energy Movement with Dr. Brian O'Leary. Brian O'Leary had been trained as an Apollo astronaut and came to be very fascinated with what he had been hearing in the frontier energy science field and had visited a lot of inventors and saw firsthand their experiments. When I met him, he invited me to come and join with him in starting the organization, which very quickly, after about a year or so, I took over the reins as the president of the organization and have served in that capacity for about 10 years. So that's kind of how I came about it. And in this intervening time since when I last spoke to you on Beyond 50, I've met many, many more scientists, inventors who've been doing really neat things in the energy science field. And I can tell you, some of the things I've seen have tremendous potential to usher in a clean energy era here on little planet Earth. It's very exciting.
Mm-hmm. You think about free energy, and some people, I think about the larger corporations, such as big oil, for instance. You can even go back to when electricity first got fired up and how, Thomas Edison tried to dominate that market, even in light of the fact that Tesla invented the alternating current motor, and it showed to be not only more superior, but also a lot cheaper, which is what people really wanted, was not to spend as much energy on it.
Right.
And you realize the potentiality for, let's call it a monopolistic point of view to prevent things like this from ever getting on the horizon. Why should we allow this to happen when it's going to cut into our profits? But the truth is we really want this more than just because we want free energy, but it's also because it's clean. It's just more efficient than the way we're going about things. Because, let's face it, drudging up and producing oil isn't really that great of a job, and it certainly is energy deficient, I would think, in the long run.
Well, it's true. The way I view this is that we have a lot of things going on the planet that are, while they are part of the economic engine of keeping things flowing in our society so that people have goods and services and a material way of life, the way we've been going about it has resulted in a lot of environmental devastation. It's resulted in a lot of economic disparity across the globe and a lot of geopolitical tension as well. Because you think about, what are we warring over?
Right.
We're warring over resources, and energy resources have a big deal to do with that. Particularly oil and gas. So when we look at the advent of some what we would call disruptive new technologies, in this case breakthrough energy technologies, what we're looking at is something that could over time displace polluting fuels like anything that we have to actually burn and produces emissions or waste, or nuclear fuels, radioactive fuels like what's the uranium and plutonium that's used in current fission nuclear power plants, and replacing those with sources of energy that are essentially infinite in their abundance, very dense in the amount of power that they produce, and would be very inexpensive. And they would allow us to have essentially our own power-generating device that we could take with us wherever we go. That's kind of the ultimate vision for this. In between here and there, what we would envision is having these types of devices available to gradually displace the coal burning and oil burning and nuclear furnaces that are used to generate the current electricity that we use. Because mostly all those processes are doing is they're burning something to generate heat, to boil water, to make steam, and to turn a turbine that's generating the electricity. Mm-hmm. So if there's another way to heat the water that's more efficient and that's cleaner and that's cheaper, well, we all have something to gain from that. And the other part of this is, what can we do if we have essentially free or at least very inexpensive energy? What can we do with that to remediate the damage that's gone on in the environment to this point? Mm-hmm. Right now, because energy is expensive, it's very difficult for us to do things like mining our landfills for resources instead of mining the earth, or cleaning up the oceans where there's so much trash and debris in the oceans nowadays. It's been devastating to the aquatic biosystem. If we had essentially free energy, we'd be able to clean up all of that stuff and recover that waste and do other things with it that's useful. So the whole recycling process of our resources gets a huge boost if we have nearly free energy. The other thing that happens that you might call it a soft benefit, but it might be the most potent of all, is that having the advent of free energy will allow the unleashing of human creativity to a degree that we haven't seen before. So there'll be so much innovation in business and industry having this available. It will cause an uplift in the standard of livings and ultimately would allow people to have more time to actually pursue their creative endowments rather than just putting in so much of their time maybe doing work that they don't find too meaningful and that really just feels like a drag on their purpose here on the earth. So we see that there's all kinds of incredible things that will go on with the advent of a new energy era.
Mm-hmm. You know, and it's interesting to take a look at the point of creativity, that if we have the free energy or the potentiality for us to enjoy it, that we would have more time to be more innovative, which is what America really stands for. Mm-hmm. But you take a look, going back, as I mentioned earlier in the program, so we had inventors such as Thomas Edison, and there was James Westinghouse. We had Nikola Tesla, for instance, and this is about energy, obviously, but, you know, here Thomas Edison comes up with a direct current, establishes that as a superior way because he actually got electricity into homes, so to speak. But then he realizes, well, wait a minute, I want to be sure that I own this whole market and nobody else can come in, and was very well known for his ruthlessness that just about ruined him.
Yeah.
But, on the other hand, it pushed him out of one area, and this is where you can kind of give applause to this, and it really falls hand in hand to what you're talking about. He walks away from that, so to speak, but then he invents the motion picture. And it's like, why can't people come to understand, okay, you probably established yourself successfully here. Why don't we put that aside, allow somebody else in to maybe improve or whatever better on this? Why don't you go on and innovate something else?
Well, it's a great question. The whole thing about monopolistic behavior and that whole desire to have it all.
Right.
It is something that is embedded in each of us from the standpoint of the fear that we have of our own self-interest being threatened. And it is just kind of an ingrained fear response. But it tends to get really distorted, especially when there's societal values that tend to worship at the altar of money and material power, and our culture is saturated with that. But there is I believe, an awakening and an opening to some higher sensibilities and the principles that we teach our children about sharing and fairness and all these things that we find so fundamental. But yet we find so difficult to apply in the world of corporations and governments and these types of institutions. But I think a lot of people are waking up to the fact that, look, we've got a lot of big global issues that are smacking us in the face all the time, and business as usual is not getting it done. There's been ever greater concentration of power in fewer hands. It's really distorting the balance on the planet. And it's a very dangerous scenario as well, because the collected wisdom of the populace as a whole continues to be marginalized, while we tend to be more at the whim of smaller and smaller groups of people who control most of the economic engine. And that's a very, very vulnerable place to be in. In fact, that whole situation has resulted in what certain researchers like Catherine Austin Fitts, Joseph Farrell, Richard Dolan, some of these who've looked at a lot of these big economic, sometimes you might call them a cabal, that are manipulating very high technology behind the scenes, that it's resulted in an actual breakaway civilization a group of people who actually could live either off planet or they could live under the earth in a way that would allow them to continue with business as usual, even if there was something catastrophic that happened on the surface. It's just such a gross disparity in capability using technologies that have not been available to the public domain, but have been sequestered in various secret projects. It's very, very distorted. Mm-hmm. And so one of the things that we're trying to do is educate the mainstream public about the fact that, hey, look, there's amazing technologies that are here. Actually, many of them have existed for decades, if not longer. But the problem has been in having these things be released to provide a social benefit to the whole global populace. Mm-hmm. And that awakening effort, that education effort, is what we feel is very important to unleash these things from behind the closed doors.
I remember a time we were discussing how you can eventually get your home off of the grid, so you're not using any external energy sources. You become pretty much completely self-contained, and even get to a point that you can actually sell energy that you've developed back, so you can actually make money from your home rather than spending money every week or every month on your electric bill. Right. And the one first question I thought of, well, what's to stop, for instance, in Portland, Oregon, I believe it's Portland General Electric, from finding a way to fine you or to, basically get their hands in your till now that you've cut them off? And so then you start getting, for instance, local government involved, and boy, I'll tell you, each county can be pretty nasty depending on which one you live in. Yeah. And you start trying to realize, well, look, I'm doing this for me. What law says that I have to buy my energy from you when I've figured this all out for myself? But it doesn't take a hard stretch of an imagination, as you said earlier, about distortion, that the truth could be distorted in such a way where all of a sudden what you've done, which was good for the earth, and certainly good for you, to demonize someone like that for even taking a shot. And I can see where some of these technologies, as you said, just aren't getting out there, that this very thing is going on, and sometimes in the name of science itself. And sometimes science bugs me because it almost seems to step on its own foot when it should be progressing.
Well, that's true, and you brought up two issues here. One is how do you keep a monopoly, in this case like an electric utility monopoly, how do you keep them from enacting policies, even legislation, that essentially keeps you chained to what they're selling, chained to the grid? Well, that's where vigilance is required. We got to make sure that undue influence is not brought by corporations, in this case an electric utility, onto legislators who supposedly have been elected and are here to serve the public. We got to be vigilant to make sure that they're not just serving deep pocket interests. Sure. So that's part of that. The other part is to realize that the decentralization of energy, where we have technologies available where you actually can go off grid, instead of generating your own power and selling it back to the grid. That's what a lot of people who are doing the solar installations are doing, where they're still tied into the grid, and they may be selling some power back, into the grid itself, but they're still connected, and they're still very much dependent on that whole grid infrastructure. What we find much more attractive is having the ability to go off the grid completely. So now you're no longer, vulnerable to having disruptions that can happen just through weather events, solar storms, sabotage, any of these things that can be very crippling to the grid type of a plan for energy distribution. But now you have something that could actually be portable energy devices, and that's more what we're focused on. When I talk new energy, I'm not talking about solar or wind or biofuels. Right. We're talking about some really neat advances that go way beyond those.
Let's talk about a couple of those, since I know we've kind of talked about, this could happen with the free energy, and here's the possibilities. But what kind of technologies are we talking about here?
Okay, so let's go and let's revisit this whole cold fusion scene here. So about 26 years ago, two electrochemists from the University of Utah made this kind of really news captivating announcement that was, hey, we discovered this new energy source. They called it cold fusion. What it essentially involved was trickling a little bit of current through water that was enriched with what's called deuterium, or it's also called heavy water. And basically, after a little bit of time, what they were showing was excess heat production that could not be accounted for by the amount of electrical energy input that went into the experiment. So they were saying they were getting excess energy off of this process, this cold fusion process. Well, very quickly, there were scientists that jumped all over these two electrochemists and promptly stomped all over them without necessarily being very careful in the vetting of the experiment itself and trying to replicate it. So basically, a lot of the very elite universities and the nuclear physicists, especially at those universities, really just came down hard, and they had the mouthpiece of the media available to them, and so they declared this whole cold fusion thing as junk science. Well, what ended up happening, though, over the last 26 years is that there's been a lot of really great research that's been done by many other universities around the world and various government institutions, including our own naval research labs, including NASA, including many corporations and small experimenters throughout the world. And this science has been advanced to a great degree. It is absolutely real. It is much more reproducible now. The results, as far as how much excess energy in the form of heat is released from these processes, is much higher now. There's also been refinement in the process. In many cases, this is no longer a water-based process. Now, what's tending to be favored is using a device that has powdered nickel in it, and using another type of solid fuel that's comprised of some lithium and aluminum and hydrogen, all into like a solid fuel pellet form. And so those reactants, the solid fuel pellet, powdered nickel, those are brought together in a small closed chamber, and then that device is electrically heated up to a certain temperature at which the hydrogen is released from the fuel pellet, and it interacts with the powdered nickel and produces excess heat far beyond the amount of energy that was inputted with the electrical heating to begin with. And generally, what's being seen very reproducibly now, because this has been now verified by several credentialed third parties, they're getting at least 3-to-1 excess energy out of the process. One technology that's a cold fusion technology that I've seen a few times, and actually the researchers are in Washington State, they've produced up to 17 times as much excess energy in the form of heat. And these processes are not, even though they're called cold fusion or they're called low energy nuclear reactions as another way of describing the process, they are not producing radioactive compounds. It's not producing harmful radiation. So these things are very high in their power density, which means they can be compact devices. They don't have to have a large footprint to them. And they'll be capable of producing the type of heat that would be very valuable for, as I said at the start of the program, for heating water. Because it's heating water that uses so much of the energy as far as fuels that are burned to produce electricity. Well, if you got something that's much more efficient and much more power dense to do that, well, that's a huge boon. So I'm very excited about the potential for cold fusion to come onto the scene here very quickly. In fact, even as we're talking right now, The 19th International Conference on Cold Fusion is being held in Italy as we speak, and it looks like there are going to be some commercial installations of cold fusion, the cold fusion process, within the next 2 years, almost certainly. And then I would say it's likely to start out as some industrial installations where they can have round-the-clock monitoring, having technical personnel there to inspect and maintain these systems, get some of the bugs worked out as well. Mm-hmm. Then the next wave would be for smaller commercial applications such as businesses, light industrial, that type of thing. And then a few more years later, it'll be more ready for the consumer, for the homeowner level. Mm-hmm. But it's always going to make more sense for the inventors of these type of novel processes to first do their installations at industrial sites where they can have round-the-clock monitoring and the technical personnel there to maintain these things.
Well, it's very encouraging, so it sounds like it is moving forward, and perhaps there won't be as much blockage as you would tend to think would happen with something new on the horizon. Yeah,
well, the other part of this is some players who are household names, like the Bill Gates type of people, they are now funding this. They're providing funding support for some targeted cold fusion research. So that's when we know that that's going on, we know that these things are they're well on their way. So it's definitely something real. It's just a fascinating topic to follow. So I think that something's going to be coming out pretty quick.
Now, earlier in the program, as I was kind of sharing details of who you are and what we were about to talk about, AquaLumine water came up, and I was kind of surprised by that. What's going on with that?
Okay, so AquaLumine, what is AquaLumine? All right, so the story goes like this. 2 years ago, I had an interview on the late-night program Coast to Coast AM, and coming off as that program, that interview ended, my phone started to ring late at night, and one of the calls that I got was from this man who said, hey, 20 years ago I made this very unusual discovery that I think you'll find very interesting. And he went on to describe himself a bit. He's a Native American. He lives in southwestern Idaho, and he had taken his family camping at this spring that he knew as a spring that had been renowned among the local Native American folks as a healing spring. And this particular night, he had been there. Family was in bed in the camper, and he was looking up at where the spring came off out of the side of this very steep slope in this canyon, and he could detect these two objects hovering over this little pool of water that was formed by some runoff from the spring. And he could see these lights going down from these two objects down toward this little pool of water. And he was astounded at what he was seeing, and then very quickly these two objects disappeared. But he could still see the soft glow of light up by that location. So he made his way up the slope to this little pool of water, and he could see sitting there this object that he described as a spherical object. It looked like it was made of hot metal. He could detect some engraving on it. And he splashed some of the water from this little pool on it. And what he said happened was this thing immediately shrunk. And then as the water ran off it and back into the pool, that whole pool became shimmering with light. And he was amazed. He took the object, put it into this coffee can, and submerged it in the water, and the object itself disintegrated, and what was left behind were all these sparkling, shimmering crystals of light that he just totally captivated him. He ended up taking this from the spring site and started to do some experiments with it, and what he was finding was that the spring water, with and without some of this crystalline material that had been there, was demonstrating really remarkable things with plants, as far as seeds germinating very quickly, plants growing very fast and very robustly, that the fruit's more delicious, that type of thing. He experimented with some of his animals. This man is a farmer. He experimented with some of his animals. He was finding that the animals always preferred the spring water versus other waters he'd provide them. And as they were drinking this, the animal behavior was becoming more intelligent. Wow. And the way he described it was the animals would not only obey his commands more perfectly, but they started to anticipate his commands. And he found that very, very fascinating. And then he was emboldened to start doing experiments on himself. And the one that I recalled most clearly from that phone call was he had said, "Hey, I did this fast of several days on the water, and I started to experience an enhancement in telepathy." And he gave me some examples of how that caused a little bit of a shock to him and some others as he was first experiencing that ability. And he went on to describe in this phone call a lot of very interesting phenomena associated with the spring water. And perhaps one of the most unusual was he found that when he would look at the water under a microscope and would be able to detect this crystalline aspect inside the water, that there would be certain times of the day where these crystals would all of a sudden transform into a set of images that were very brief in duration, but that could be captured photographically. And so he essentially taught himself how to do photomicroscopy. Now, this is a very unsophisticated farmer, as he described himself, but he had also told me that he was becoming more intelligent as he continued to drink this water. Wow. And he basically ended up producing thousands of these images captured through photomicroscopy. And I have seen these, as have many dozens of people who I've provided these to gain their insight from this. But the images themselves are so dense with information, and what you see in them, you'll see images of animals, of various humanoid type of beings, but not necessarily the type of human that's here on the planet. You'll see like structures that look like celestial scenes of planets, molecules, various type of craft that some might describe as UFOs, things like that. And all of this is being captured from these very temporary images that are coming right out of the water itself. And it's just a totally fascinating phenomenon. And so based on these and his accounts of having provided this water to people who were gravely ill, and that he witnessed their recovery from these grave illnesses, I felt compelled to go make a visit to him, and I did that. And I went and I saw the sites of where he had described all of these things. I had examined the water as well, and I'm legitimately an expert in water chemistry. It's been the kind of the foundation of my career for the last 30 years, and I could not explain what was going on this. I'd never really seen this before, and then I asked that I said, look, I also want to meet some of these people who you claim had these dramatic physical recoveries when they started to drink the water. And so without him pre-notifying the people who he took me to, because I was with them the whole time, we basically dropped in on a couple different individuals who showed me their medical records, which in two cases included oncology reports, and they told me their story about how this man, and I'll tell you his name is Matthew. So Matthew had come to them when they were gravely ill, and he said, I have a gift for you here. And he says, the gift is this water. And he said, but the water itself will not heal you. You can only do that yourself. But if you're willing to speak your intention to the water, it has the capacity to carry that information and intention into your body, and it will go to work on your cells. But you just simply have to trust that and drink the water, and then you'll see for yourself. And it was as simple as that. That's all that he really gave them as far as guidance for this. And these people told me that they had dramatic recoveries, and they showed me in one case before and after pictures. I mean, the one guy was essentially, on his deathbed in the hospital, and his family are showing me, his wife and his 20-year-old son are showing me all these pictures of what happened from that day where Matthew arrived with the water versus, where he was standing there in front of me giving me his own personal account, now fully, 200 pounds, robust, back to work and enthusiastic for life again. So, we left the scene there after those testimonies, and I just asked Matthew, I said, how many people are there like this? And he said, I've lost count. There's dozens. I don't know. He says, I don't keep track anymore. He says, but I've just been, happy to be able to help people with this water. So I asked him what was the nature of him contacting me, that night that he called me after the Coast to Coast radio show, because I assumed that he had heard me on the radio program and had called me just as like a follow-up question. And he said, no. He says, I don't even know what you're talking about as far as a radio program. he said, what I had done, Joel, is I had come to this point after 20 years of investigation of this water to realize that I need to get this out into the world, but I don't know who I should ask to help me do this. And he says, so what I did, I went into my search engine on my computer, and I entered words that I thought might be associated with the type of people who could help me. And he said, but before I pressed go for the search engine, I just kind of sat back and I thought, this is really silly. And so he walked away from his computer. And he came back sometime later, and he said, without him having done anything else, there were 4 names on the screen, which he thought was very unusual. So he took the 4 names, wrote them down on a piece of paper as they appeared on the screen. Then he took some of the water that had the crystal in it, apparently the same, what he would call the mother crystal from that original artifact that was at that spring site that first night. And he had some of the water there, and he just had it in a glass and was placing it near each of these names, from the top, the first name on the top, the 4th name on the bottom, and he was just observing what happened in the water. And he said with the first name, nothing. The water was very still. The second name, nothing. The third name, nothing happened in the water, but he said he got a very uneasy feeling. And then the 4th name, the water started to move, and it started to show this sparkly shimmer in the water. And he went back and repeated this a couple more times and got those same consistent results. So he said he resolved to call that 4th name, and if they didn't answer the phone or weren't interested, he would go back to the top of the list. And then he said, well, you answered the phone and you appear interested. and I tell you, I got this just energetic wave that just shot through my body at that moment, and also this very distinct sense of the weight of a responsibility. And so I said, well, look, what do you want me to do? And he said, I want you to help me get this water out and help me enable it to break up the distortions that are happening on the planet here. He says, people are the ones who are making choices to essentially, foul the nest of the planet in so many ways. Whether it's through manipulation of the population, whether it's through not honoring the natural processes of the earth and polluting the soil, the air, and the waters, through the warring, all these other dysfunctions that are going on. He said through his own experience, he realized that the water was allowing him to be much more clear in his receptivity of what he felt was the spiritual guidance that's available to everyone. And he very clearly identified himself as a deeply spiritual man with a distinct Christian orientation, and that he feels strongly that it's part of his mission was to be given this gift and basically the impulse to research it and investigate it, but now he needed some help. So I said, well, look, the only place I know to start is I will assemble a group of people who I know and trust, who are high consciousness people, and ask them to do an experiment with me, to do a 3-month experiment with me with the water, where we'd each consume the water and just chronicle what happens and go from there. Which I did. So that group came to comprise about 35 people, and as the group did this experiment, there were a lot of amazing things that people were noting. There were a lot of physical benefits of various sorts that people were experiencing, and a lot of what we've come to call supersensory benefits as well, including the same things Matthew had referred to as far as some enhanced telepathic abilities or precognitive abilities, enhanced synchronicities, lucid dreams. These are the types of things that the focus group, that's what I call them, the focus group, which was the experimental group I assembled, these were things they were reporting. As well as in several instances, they reported that there were various addictions, chemical addictions, that were being essentially just falling away without effort. So while everyone was doing the same type of what we would call Matthew's prescription for how you use the water, which was to expose it to the sunlight for a couple minutes or to daylight if possible, and be holding it with gratitude, but then speaking aloud what your intention was for the water before you consume it. Those were the only instructions that we were given, and that was consistent with the focus group. And so the folks who were finding these addictions, which in this case there were 3 smokers in the group, and each of them said that it wasn't even part of their intention, but yet these addictive tendencies just fell away of their own. And then there were others who, since that time, had noted that if they had tend to have a thirst for alcohol, that was lessening over time as well. So, very, very curious things. So out of that focus group experiment, there were basically three questions that I had posed to the group. I said, look, I'm interested in knowing, is this, one, is it safe? 2, is it effective? And 3, is it something that should be made available to the public as a whole? And what came out of that focus group experiment after those several months was, yes, yes, yes on all accounts. So what I committed to do was to start an organization that would make the water available. And the first person who I thought to help me with that, a man named Tom. Tom was part of our focus group. I had, as I was driving one evening, I got this strong message, this internal message that came into my mind, and it said, call Tom, ask him to help you start the organization for the water distribution. So I pull over to the side of the road, I called this guy Tom, and I said, hey Tom, I just received this inner message, very profound, but it basically asked me to invite you to help me start this organization for the water. And Tom says, hey, that'd be great, and I want to show you the logos I've already developed for it.
Wow.
And that type of thing, Daniel, has been going on ever since then. And so we named the water AquaLumine to reflect that it's water that shines, it's water that enlightens, it's reflecting that same property, both this crystalline aspect that Matthew had identified in the water, but also the fact that people have been reporting that it's enhancing their perception, it's opening them up, and in certain cases, some of the most moving testimonies of those who were drinking the water was how their spiritual connection had been deepened, and that they were finding that as an extremely valuable benefit to them. So we had launched this at the beginning of March, on March 5, and what we have done since is we decided that we would hold 2 monthly AquaLumine Community gatherings at a church in Portland, and it's the Unity Church on Southeast Stark. It's Southeast 45th and Stark in Portland at the Unity Church. So 2 evenings a month we've been having these gatherings where people can come, they can actually have their first experience of the water. Others there can discuss what they're experiencing, and I provide as much of the story behind what I've experienced with Matthew directly, and what's been going on out at the spring, and many of these other fascinating phenomena that Matthew have reported from my dozens and dozens of hours of spending with them. So that's what we continue to do. So we're very, very early into this because we just launched this in March. Our next gatherings will be on Sunday, April 26th at 7 p.m. at the Unity Church on Southeast Stark, and then the one after that will be on Thursday, May 14th at 7 p.m. as well. And anyone who's interested in learning more about the water and about these gatherings can simply go to the website healthyselfwater.com. That's healthyselfwater.com, and you can learn all about this. But we're very excited in what we're seeing. This community that's gathering around the water is very enthusiastic, and I've been invited to come and present essentially the story of the water, which I'm doing very briefly here with you here on the radio program. But I go into much more depth at these various presentations. And I had just talked to a group from the Institute of Noetic Science over in Vancouver. And that's Institute of Noetic Science is the group that Edgar Mitchell, the Apollo astronaut, he was the last man who officially walked on the moon with Apollo 17. That's the group he started. There's another group, the Northwest Society of Dowsers. I'll be talking to them on April 24 and presenting information. But we're very early into this, but we're very excited about what we're seeing. Our intention and Matthew's intention is to bring rigorous science to better understand what these phenomena are. For instance, how are these images occurring within the water, and then being captured photographically, and trying to determine what is the meaning of the content in there. Part of Matthew's, I guess you would call it the download of information that he's gotten over time, because he does claim that whoever was intelligently operating those two objects that were beaming these beams of light down at that pool of water that very first night, he says he continues to receive information from those intelligent sources, and that some of the information he's received is that the sunlight itself coming from our star contains the information of the creation of our whole solar system. And he says that information is essentially being beamed continuously all throughout our solar system, including to our planet. And water itself has an innate capability to be imprinted with energy and information. In fact, research from folks like Masaru Emoto, many of your audience would be familiar with Emoto and his book, The Hidden Messages in Water, where he did these experiments where he would have either like words written on a jar of water. Some were positive in nature, some were negative in nature. He'd freeze the water and then analyze the crystalline structure. And you could see how the very affirming types of words that were put on the water resulted in very beautiful crystals, where the ones that were more negative in tone resulted in these very fractured and ugly-looking crystals. And that's just one example of some good research that's been done on water's capacity to be imprinted with information and intention. But there are many others who are doing such type of research. Gerald Pollack up at the University of Washington has been doing a lot of amazing water research as well. But the long and short of it here is, if Matthew's information is correct, and that light itself from our star is bringing vast amounts of celestial information and making it available to us, to the life forms on our planet, which are primarily comprised of water. You know, our bodies are at least 70% water. Mm-hmm. And that the spring water itself, with this unique crystalline component in it, is somehow able to either amplify or transform or transmit some of the captured information, so that we can actually even see that it's there. That's just an amazing phenomenon. And we don't understand how it's happening. We do want to get to that point, and we want to be able to gain something from the content that's there. And so anyone who comes and they actually see these images, and you know, they'll just see the vast amount. It's almost, even though you're looking at a planar photograph image, it has a holographic type of depth to it that just has layers upon layers of these images and information in it. I've really seen nothing like it before. So anyway, that's the type of unusual anomalies that are part and parcel of what's going on with the AquaLumine water.
Such fascinating stuff to be able to explore, and the nice thing about it is being able to stand on the cusp and move forward rather than being held still, you know, and to be able to get to a point where we can all express ourselves to a point where we live up to a potential that can simply astound us.
You're right. You're right about that. And see, what's very clear in this is each person has some role to play in these types of things. I mean, I've met so many people doing amazing invention, a new discovery, whether it's in the energy science or something like Matthew with the spring water and all that. And these are humble people. They're not people, you know, up on a stage clamoring for attention or whatever. They're just doing what is naturally coming to them as their passion, and what they are sensing as their mission of service, I guess would be a good way of saying it. Yeah, I definitely feel my own. You know, I had my own experience of that voice that said, hey, you know, you're to help bring the new form of energy into the planet. I took that seriously because it was an authentic experience for me, very personally profound. And everybody has those types of leadings in their lives if they're open to them, and everyone has their role to play. There's no one person who's ascendant above everyone else, and more important, everybody's got a role to play. And so my invitation to anyone who's hearing my conversation is, hey, if the impulse strikes you and you find this of interest, you know, come and see if there's something that speaks to you about this, and see what your role ends up being. Because I'm convinced that there's going to be many thousands of people who are part of this adventure, and it's very exciting, and we're just starting on it.
Well, it's such a pleasure to have you back on the program today. It's always an astounding conversation, to say the very least. And for our listeners, go ahead and give out that website again.
Sure. So to learn more about the AquaLumine water, you can go to healthyselfwater.com. healthyselfwater.com. And we have our next upcoming community gathering meeting will be at the Unity Church at Southeast 45th and Stark in Portland, and that'll be that Sunday, April 26th at 7 p.m. If you want to learn more about the energy information, please go to newenergymovement.org. That's newenergymovement.org. We're a nonprofit, and you can learn more there, and you may choose to support the work that we're doing there.
Well, very good. Well, Joel, thank you. It's been a pleasure to have you back on the program again. Let's not let time be too much of a distance the next time we talk.
Well, thank you, Daniel. I really appreciate you having me on.
You bet. We want to thank you, the listeners out there, for tuning in. A couple of action steps for you to take by visiting those two websites. We'll have those posted at our website at beyond50radio.com. That is the number 50, and also we encourage you to sign up for our free weekly e-newsletter. I'm Daniel Davis. Thank you for joining us. This is the Beyond 50 radio program, and remember, live your day past halfway.